So the title, Research Data and Machines, the Next Generation of Scientific Exploration. So in particular, I'll look at the changes in data, the effect and what behavior changes that introduces, and finally end with some challenges and needs. And I'll give some examples of how computer science can really make a difference to some of the problems that we're trying to battle today. So, as you all know, data size in science is increasing dramatically. So we have the Human Genome Project in the 90s, which requires only 750 megabytes of storage. We have the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, which is the particle physicists. I used to be a particle physicist, which actually collects tens of petabytes a year. And the physicists, the astronomers, have very ambitious plans called the Square Kilometre Array. And it's not clear that this is actually going to exist in exactly this form, but if it does, it'll create millions of petabytes a day, which you won't be able to keep all of it. So there are big data challenges at the high end of scientific research. But that's not where most people are, but that's the frontier, if you like. So the complexity is increasing. Instead of an Excel spreadsheet and a simple list and a flow chart, we're actually going to much more complex data sets where you have relationships like networks, like we talked about this morning, all sorts of other things. And this is a quotation, you see, what's meant by data nowadays to accompany your scientific discovery. Recorded information, regardless of the form it may be recorded, writings, films, sound recordings, drawings, designs, graphic representations, are lots of different types of data, and it isn't all amenable to putting in a structured form. And so unstructured data are certainly becoming important. And increasingly, we have lots of now new data sources from sensors. So these are the old-fashioned sensors, thermometer, clock and temperature and pressure and so on. And these are now becoming digital, and you can see we have satellite images, we have wireless trackers, we have heartbeat monitors, and on the bottom there you have a Kinect sensor sensing people's motion. All of these are different types of data sets which scientists and engineers have to deal with. And of course, data can be transmitted wirelessly, and we're going to connect all these things together. And there's a nice quotation there, which is from Justin Ratner, who used to be the Chief Technical Officer of Intel until just a few weeks ago. Not only hard sensors, the things we talked about, track physical things, but also soft sensors like the stuff that we uses calendar, social network, web browsing. Context awareness does is collect all of that up to the minute on physical sensors, some of which is collected incrementally over a long period of time. And all this sort of data now is all connected wirelessly, and this is where we're heading, the Internet of Things, and how we deal with that, how we manage the data that comes from that is a major challenge for computer science. At the same time, Microsoft, Google, IBM, others, Amazon are building out massive data infrastructure. So this is a sample of our major data centers around the world, and they're usually located, for example, the one in Washington State where I live is at Quincy, and it's right next to a river, a dam, where you get cheap hydroelectric power. So these are very efficient, designed to be minimal energy consumption, and there's a nice quotation there. Data centers have become as vital to the functioning of society as power stations. So data centers of various types, besides these ones, for example, in Australia, we don't have a data center in Australia. There has to be a sort of data caching, a CDN network site in Australia, which actually sort of is a halfway house between these major data centers. The nearest one to Australia is either Singapore or Hong Kong. Why is that significant? Well, the cloud is actually changing the way we do business. It's also changing the way we do science. It's available all the time. You can upload data, download, you can stream signals, network between devices. It offers a huge number of services all the time. It gives you time that you don't have to pay for storage that you only use occasionally. You can store to the cloud when you need it, as you need it. You pay only for what you use. So for small companies, for startups, and for example, for students who want to start their company, they don't have to have money to buy lots of equipment. They can just rent it in the cloud and get started very easily. And it's a very easy way to lower the barriers to starting companies, to starting businesses, to starting doing science. It's also a way to collaborate because you can be in different places and you can access the cloud, you can share data, you can share algorithms, you can write papers, you can also do, increasingly there is a concern about making research repeatable, which means you have actually to have other people to be able to use the data to do their algorithms to see if they can get the same results or extend it. So I've talked about the extreme parts of science, and science is now becoming much more data intensive, but there are degrees of science. So first of all, there's these very big fields. These small number of researchers use very large amounts of data, petabytes, and now moving towards exabytes. And they're typically, these scientists have a budget for managing data, and they have actually a software effort to do software engineering to support their experiments, which may last for many years. Like the CERN Hadron Collider, that will last to thousands of physicists working on it, and the people who wrote the software will have retired while it's still being used. So you have actually to use software engineering techniques in science, which has not been the tradition, I have to say, among physicists, but now you have to actually use modern software engineering and engineering development techniques. Most of science is in a slightly smaller domain. So, for example, genomics, I talked about things like the human genome, but now we're going to do not only one genome, we're going to do genomes of all of us. It will be for less than $100. They'll be very shortly able to do your genome, my genome, everybody's, and be able to find out much more possibilities for personalized medicine. And that's actually an opportunity again for computer science, and I'll come back to that. But actually most of science, for the environmental scientists, biologists, and so on, they're actually small data. They have thousands of small files, maybe hundreds of thousands of small files. And it's managing this, if you like, the long tail of science is actually a problem. So in data, it's not just the volume, it's also the variety of data. And if in case of sensor networks, it's also the velocity of the data coming in. So I like to think instead of just big data, which is not very helpful to most scientists, I like to characterize it by 3 V's, for volume, variety, and velocity. And for most scientists, that's a more relevant classification than just big data. A quotation there, people like to buy clusters. Actually, using the cloud enables you not to buy a cluster, and it's often much more cost effective for you to do your analysis up in the cloud. You don't need to have and maintain your cluster. I used to run a research group myself, and we used to run big machines. Parallel computers is what I used to do. And of course, it means that some postdoc or grad student becomes the expert on the machine. And that's fine, it's a very useful skill, but that may not have been what they intended to do when they did their PhD in environmental science, to go and be the system programmer for the cluster for the group. So actually using the cloud gets rid of all that, and you can actually do much more cost effective. You can get to your science without all the loading of the software, the updating of the software, the maintaining of the system. So these are just some of the headlines to show that science is changing. Tidal wave of scientific data. So Wired magazine was claiming that with all this data, all you need is Google search and you'll be able to do science. Scientists would disagree with that, by the way. But there are serious challenges in Nature, in The Economist and the ACM, all looking at the challenges of big data. As one example of what we've done, we've looked at satellite data. So this is just to see how you can create a service for scientists. And for the satellite data, this is for the MODIS satellite. It's a NASA satellite which goes around the Earth taking photographs, and it takes strips of photographs. And what you have to do is put them together and do some clever image processing. And maybe you can persuade a very dedicated graduate student to deal with 100 files, or maybe even 1,000 files. But when you get 60,000 files, you need to automate the process. So this is a way of automating the process of taking the data from the satellite, collecting it up, putting it together to make an image which corrects the edges and puts it together. And then you do some analysis on that before you finally get to something that's valuable for science. So there's a whole lot of processing that needs to take place. We're just looking at what the costs are of doing that. And so this is actually, you can process a year's worth of data to give the scientists a data set that they can do something with, and it costs about $1,000 in this particular experiment to do a year's worth of data, which is probably fairly cheap, since it would probably cost you more than that if the graduate student did it. So, changes in the data. Lots more data to deal with, much more complicated to analyze, much more complicated to manage, much more complicated to curate. And we'll come back to that later. But what we've seen increasingly is, and you heard a little bit this morning, businesses are very interested in analyzing data, social networks for advertising, targeting, advertisements, and so on. So more data, incorporation of lots of data sources. You have streaming engines. It can be typically structured data which goes into a relational database, but increasingly it can be unstructured. It can also come from a continuous stream, the complex event processing engine. You can put it into a data warehouse, which might be physical, or it might be somewhere in the cloud. You don't need to have it on your premises, and you can actually then do analysis to be able to give the users some service which they find useful. So this is increasingly the sort of way business is going, and using the algorithms of computer science to analyze this huge amounts of data. And we heard a little bit today about Mapreduce. It does some things. There are other things it doesn't do so well. So actually, Hadoop is a way of dealing with unstructured data, which just distributes the data and processing in a very simple Mapreduce type style. And that's used by many industries, but there are increasingly opportunities for new algorithms and new types of analysis. And that's, again, the sort of things that I hope you learn about at this summit. So that's what's happening in business. What are the implications in science? Well, implications in science are that the nature of research is changing. So this is taken from my colleague Jim Gray, who alas is no longer with us. He pointed out that thousands of years ago, experimental science was done by the Egyptians and by the Greeks and so on, making measurements of the heavens and so on, stars. And since Isaac Newton and Leibniz and Maxwell and so on, we've now got theoretical science where you can actually summarize a lot of those results in laws of nature, which you can then analyze mathematically and make predictions in given situations, which you can go and test experimentally. And those were the first two ways we've done science for hundreds of years, with experiment and theory. And you can make tests of a theory by doing experiments. And that's the two paradigms that we've always used to do science in the last few hundred years. But in the 1950s, we invented computers. And computers gives you another paradigm, another way of doing science, because what you can do now is you can do experiments that you can't do physically. For example, climate change. We only have one Earth. It's not possible to run different models. And so if you want to know about galaxy formation, star formation, black holes, and so on, the only way you can do those type of experiments is doing computer simulations. And to do that, you need to train a new breed of student. Yes, you need to know how to do experiments and how to do theory, but you also need to know how about algorithms, numerical methods, how to program parallel computers, the parallel programming languages, and so on. So those are new skills you need to teach people. And that's certainly been true for the last 50 years or so. But increasingly, with data coming in, we need a fourth paradigm, which is the what you do with data. How do you organize the data? How can you share it? How can you put it into a relational database? How can you analyze it? How can you visualize it? And these are new skills that we need to teach the next generation of scientists and grad students, in addition to knowing about theory and experiment. So it's a different type of way of doing science, requires new skills. And so Jim Gray called that the fourth paradigm. And you'll find in that book there, it's a book you can download over the internet for free. It's under open access, and you can also buy it from Amazon. It contains a collection of essays of scientists, with computer scientists, looking to see 5 years ahead where their field will be 5 years ahead. So these are meant to be readable essays as opposed to very technical papers, and the format is that there's environment, health and well-being, the infrastructure you need, and also the revolution in how we publish these things. And the second book I showed there is a book called Science at Microsoft, which gives examples of how computer scientists are working with scientists to solve some of the problems of the world. So if you want to see these things, these are all available on the web, and you can download them. So this is an article by a well-known environmental scientist, Jeff Dozier, who points out, I showed you the MODIS satellite data. Well, you need to combine that data, with measurements in the Earth, and this is what he talks about, the fourth paradigm. You need to combine data sets in order to make estimates of, in this case, he's an expert on the snow cover in the mountains. And with climate change, there'll be less snow in the summer, which means there'll be less water in the summer, and it also means there'll be more flooding in winter because the water isn't deposited as snow up in the mountains. And so there are big changes, and to do that you need actually to combine different data sets. So this is an article which explains that. So I'd just like to give then a few examples of how big data and machine learning with the cloud can really make a big difference to making informed, intelligent decisions. So I think it's a very fortunate time for computer science. We can actually not only do interesting things in our own field, computer science, we can also work with scientists to solve really exciting problems. So let me just give you an example. First of all, machine learning is certainly becoming more applicable to these problems. Supervised machine learning, which means you have a labeled data set to learn from, but increasingly with large amounts of data, you're doing unsupervised learning, and those are two techniques that are becoming really important. There's a collaboration between Andrew Ng and Jeff Dean, 16,000 processors to create a neural network with more than 1 billion connections. So you can do really impressive simulations, and these are doing work on images from YouTube. The second one is an example that my boss, Rick Rashid, who runs Microsoft Research, did last year at a conference in China. Machine translation and speech recognition has now got good enough by using machine learning techniques on huge amounts of data. It's now possible to actually, when Rick spoke in English, it was translated into speech recognition into the English digitally, and then they translated the text into Chinese. They did speech generation from Chinese text to Chinese speech, and they made it appear in the same vocal pattern as Rick. So he spoke in English, and it came out, after he said it in English, it came out him saying it in Chinese. And it was a remarkable demonstration of the power of using machine learning techniques for both speech recognition and machine translation. And that's now certainly better than rule-based techniques for doing that. So I'd like to take an example relevant to Russia. So in 2010, there were large forest fires in Russia, as I'm sure most of you know, and huge amounts of damage were done, some estimates of billions of dollars and so on. There was a national emergency, and the fires lasted from July to early September. So, and temperatures of 40 degrees were partly to blame for that. And here's a map of the fires around Moscow. So there were large numbers of fires around Moscow. So the question is, what can we do to help that? What can the cloud and machine learning to do to help that? Well, we can't do anything to help that, but what we did do was something that happened analogously in Greece. So in 2007, there were very bad forest fires in Greece. Again, just like you had in Russia in 2010, you had a heat wave with more than 40 degrees for many periods of time. These fires destroyed hundreds of thousands of acres. It killed 80 people. Over 2,000 buildings were burnt. And here, 56 people, as the blaze actually came to the outskirts of Athens. So it's really very serious. And so the question is, what can you do about that? You can't help with nature. It's a little late to do something about global warming. But what Microsoft research, Microsoft employees who were Greek wanted to do something to help. And so they collaborated with researchers in universities in Greece to build a system which would help. And it's called Greek Fire, Virtual Fire. And it was deployed on an island, because on an island, one of the Greek islands, if you have a really bad fire, it could really be very catastrophic. The whole island could be wiped out. So in this case, this was where it was deployed using the cloud, Windows Azure. And it included lots of data sources. There are lots of data sources you can have. So you can have a computer weather model. So you can run the weather model so you know ahead what's the likely weather conditions going to be. You can also have the real-time data from the satellite and the sensors that the weather forecasters have. You can have that data. You can link it to the island topography, the mountains and the crops, and whether it's trees, whether it's corn crops or whatever. And you put the road networks on, the emergency fire stations and vehicles, and you have the history of what's happened in the past in the urban and agricultural areas, and you connect it to the fire and emergency services. And what you can do that requires a fair amount of resources which you're not necessarily going to have on a Greek island, but because you can use the cloud, you have the resources to do that. And furthermore, you have the algorithms from machine learning to go and apply to all that data to make predictions so that you can find out that there's high winds coming, storms with lightning, and you can find out which are the most likely areas. You can simulate how a fire will propagate given a wind direction. So you can send out your teams to go and take some remedial action in areas which are critically dangerous. So this is a real deployment, and it's being used in Greece as we speak. And clearly you could do something similar in Russia, and it may be necessary to go do that. And that's how computer scientists can actually go and make a real impact immediately. We also have machine learning applied to genomics. And again, why we're doing that, they want to understand the causes of disease, what are the markers for disease. If you've got this gene defect, you're likely to get this disease and so on. And in addition, ultimately, the pharmaceutical companies would like to know, with your gene profile, what drugs they should give you, because it's a fact that many of the drugs that are prescribed don't have any effect on you. It's only a subset of the people it works with, and depending on the particular genetic profile you have. So, and you can also predict if you're going to get a bad reaction. So this is the reason why people want to do personalized medicine. And so what we've been trying to do, that was not the slide I intended to show. Okay, I'll come back to that slide. So David Heckerman, who is the machine learning guru who takes over what's called the eScience Research Group, and his team have developed a new algorithm for dealing with what's called genome-wide association studies. That's like taking the genome for all the people in this room and trying to correlate who's got which defect, who had which disease or medical problem. And so that's what genome-wide association studies. And they're very important, but they can be very difficult to do because there can be correlations in the population, maybe from one family, from one region, which actually give you spurious effects. And to get rid of that, you'd like to take out those effects using an algorithm. And you can do that, but it was very difficult to scale that algorithm because the computational load grew like a cube, n cubed. And so what they've actually managed to do is to develop an algorithm which doesn't change the complexity class, but it changes it from n cubed to linear. So instead of only being able to do a few thousand samples, they can now do orders of magnitude more. And that makes a very big difference. You can see much weaker signals. You can actually go and understand the data much better. And so we did an experiment, again using the cloud. It's called the Moondog project. We looked at public genome data from the Wellcome Trust, which looked at 7 different diseases, common diseases like diabetes, like hepatitis, and so on. And what they did was look at not just individual defects, but correlations. If you had this disease, was that correlated with this SNP and this SNP? So they looked at correlated pairs of these gene defects. And that took 1,000 compute years and generated tens of terabytes of data. Now, if you'd done that on a normal system, it would have taken you a very long time. But because you could use, in this case, 27,000 cores, you could do that in just a few days. And so it shows you the power of using the cloud to do previously unimaginably complex calculations. Here you needed a new algorithm, and you needed to use the power of the cloud. And from that, this is a new result they've just published in Nature, one of the Nature journals, which is about a correlation between 2 gene defects, labeled in this way here, and particular coronary heart disease. So that's one of the discoveries you can make with these types of analysis. And the last example I'll give is, again, those two are very academic, if you like, although the genomic one clearly has huge impacts. But this is another healthcare problem, which is about people in hospital. And it's a fact that if you go into intensive care into hospital, one of the problems is you're treated in intensive care, very expensive, and then they send you home. And it turns out that 1 in 5 of the people who are sent home get called back into hospital to intensive care. And that's a very expensive thing to send them home and then have to bring them back. And it's estimated to cost the US $17 billion a year. So how can machine learning help on that? Well, what you have to do is you look not only at what they went into intensive care for, but you look at all the other data. You look at all their different types of complaints, their gender, the demographics, the lab results for all the sort of things they've had. And you take a whole picture of all this type of data, 25,000 different variables. And from that, you can actually try and calculate a classifier. And what difficulty is, you want to try and predict which patients are most likely, if you release them, to be called back. And if you can identify those, then you can give those extra help to make sure that they don't come back. And so, but the trouble is, you need to make sure that it's only done with probability, and you need to reduce the number of false alarms. And so you need to get something which has the lowest number of false positives. And so that's the analysis they did, and what they have achieved is that they actually achieve a reasonable prediction. So they've now put this actually into service in a hospital, and it's actually now being used in hospitals. It's called the readmissions manager. And so you can tell with high probability that this person will have a high probability of being readmitted compared to that person. So you make sure they have extra nursing care, extra support to try and prevent them being called back. So that's machine learning applied to data. The other aspect about big data is just getting a hand to what's going on. And that's why data visualization is going to be increasingly important. And here is a visualization again. It's a famous visualization. It's about Napoleon's march to Moscow. The big yellow one is the size of his army when he came, and the little black line is the size of his army when he came back. And you can see that there was a disaster happen, and you can see that very easily from this prediction. And this is another type of prediction made by Hans Rosling, showing that data visualization, different types of data visualization are important. And so visualization of data to get an understanding of what's going on is important. You've seen visualizations this morning of social networks. These are similar ones, and you'll hear later on in the school about Worldwide Telescope. This is a visualization where you can see not only the visible sky, you can also see what the sky looks like in the infrared, the ultraviolet, gamma ray, and radio waves. And so you can put together a whole picture. But it's a very complicated amount of data. So how do you make sense of it? Well, what Worldwide Telescope allows you to do is it allows you to get an expert, like an astronomer, to give you a tour of the data. So we have, for example, Alyssa Goodman, she's a professor at Harvard, talking about star formation. And she looks at these stars in the infrared, she looks at it in the visible, and she goes somewhere else in the galaxy and looks at other stars at a different stage of formation. She can look at young stars, old stars, and so on. And she gives you a tour through the data. And that idea of having a guide to take you through these different data sets is, I think, a very powerful one. Digital storytelling, we call it. So there'll be a talk about that, and actually this was used in the Moscow Planetarium. Last week there was a show. Well, that's looking outwards. You can also use a similar tool to look inwards, and this is looking at the Earth. What's plotted there are all the seismic events that took place in the last year. And if Wegener, who developed the theory of continental drift, had this way of visualizing data, he would have been able to convince people. Here on the left is the sort of ring of fire around the Pacific Ocean. Here in the middle there, you see the mid-Atlantic spreading of the Atlantic plates. So you'd have seen plate tectonics very easily. And you can use these visualization tools. This is the Japanese earthquake, and this is somebody's model of the plate slipping underneath the subduction zone, which is where the earthquake's caused by that catastrophic collapse. And you can actually go and do a fly and tour around and examine exactly your simulation. So this is one way of exploring data, understanding what your model is. Your model capturing everything? You can go and compare it with the data in new ways. And I believe that's going to be extremely important in dealing with these large amounts of data. So lastly, challenges and needs. Okay, so let's look at that. Now, I know in Russia you do a Yandex search, but this is a Bing search, all right? So we do have a search engine. It is called Bing. And this is searching for data scientists in Bing. So this is the data scientist, the hottest job you haven't heard of. Well, actually, people have heard of it now, and there's lots of now people looking at what it takes to be a data scientist. So this is one view of a data scientist. There's sort of three aspects of it. It covers from the data creation right down to the data curation at the end. And there are people who are actually looking after the data engineers, low level, making sure they capture the data, it's stored correctly, and so on. There's the data analyst, people who explore the data through data mining, statistical methods that we've talked about, and graphical methods. And people who look after it, because you've paid a lot of money to get this data, and it's difficult if you're taking measurements of the temperature in the Bering Straits, for example. You can't go and repeat that. If you lose it, you've lost it forever. So people need to be able to curate and manage, so you'll be able to capture some of that data and read it in 20 years' time. So data scientist skills are going to be important, and computer science is going to play a role in many of those. This is just a slide of data science courses. This is looking at Columbia University are now offering a course in data science which covers analytics, statistics, and all this sort of stuff, as well as computer science. And these are universities in the US who are now offering data science courses. I don't know if there are any in Russia, but that's actually what's happening in the US. So, the data life cycle. Increasingly, data is central to all we do in science, and it goes from data acquisition to the way you collaborate and visualize. You may want to do analysis and data mining, then you want to publish it and share it, and maybe then you want to preserve it. And so there's technical challenges to all of that. There's privacy, security, data portability, and so on, protocols, metadata standards. And there's also social aspects to it, right? There's economic sustainability. Who's going to pay for keeping all this data for 20 years? Somebody's got to. How can you actually understand the scholarly implications? Physicists now are reconciled with these experiments at the Large Hadron Collider to publishing paper with 1,000 authors. And most fields are not used to that. They have only a small number. But increasingly, you're going to have to pool data to make results. So going from a 3-author paper to a 30-author paper will be a big step for many different disciplines. So, publication's going to change too. Challenges there. This is a slide from Bill Gates in 2005, that you really will now have data. You'll publish your paper with the data, and it'll be interactive. You can go to the data immediately. You can go to the simulation, run the simulation. The documents can be updated. The documents will allow other people to go and check the data, reproducible research. You can share it much more easily. And there may be different ways than traditional citations or refereeing to actually have impact. There's a whole service called Faculty of 1,000, which is in biology and medicine, where 1,000 academics are asked each month, what was the most interesting paper you read last month? And they'll say, I read this paper, I read that paper. And you can choose which one you follow. See, Andrew may have very good selections. You say, the papers he recommends are really interesting. The ones that I recommend certainly aren't, so you follow him rather than me. So you have a choice, and so there are different ways, people are exploring different ways of academic credit, academic publications in all sorts of ways. And the vision that we're moving towards, because there's now all research funding agencies around the world, almost all of them, have come together and said, we have, for research that is funded by the government, by people's taxes, should be made available to the general public. So you will have, at the top of this pyramid from Jim Gray, you'll have all the literature. You'll be able to go to get the actual paper. You'll be able to go from the paper to the data. You'll be able to do your experiment, to add some data to their data, to make new discoveries, to publish it, your paper, linked to your new data. And so this is a way Jim felt, and I also believe, that research can be accelerated. So we see a lot of wasted effort, people reproducing the same thing. Sorry, wrong way. So we are, I think, seeing real evolution here. All these different computing, cloud, Internet of Things, sensors, digitization, cloud analytics, and digital storytelling, reproducible data scientists, and machine learning for all sorts of types of predictions. So those are the major trends, both in business but also in science. And I believe what will be in your future will be machine learning, some visualization technologies, could be these graphical networks, for example, for clouds, for social networks, and cloud services. And these are some of the major trends which are going to transform business, but they're also going to transform science. And so there is an opportunity now for scientists to really make a difference on problems people care about. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions if there are any, or else is it coffee time? Yeah, I'll be around today and tomorrow. Sounds good. Thank you very much, guys.